You are taking a live look at the White House at this hour, and I actually want to pop this up on your screen as a new report this morning from Axios claims the U.S. could be moving toward military action in Iran, despite officials from both the U.S. and Iran saying it appears Tuesday's nuclear talks in Geneva went fairly well. Barak Ravid with Axios writing an article this morning saying, quote, Trump moves closer to a major war with Iran. It could come sooner and be much bigger than most recognized, sources tell me. Vice President J.D. Vance was speaking on Fox News just yesterday and had a lot to say as he was asked questions about the situation with Iran, as well as several other topics. Now, I do want to play just a quick moment here from that interview as he addressed those talks that took place just yesterday there in Geneva. And unfortunately, it looks like we do not have that soundbite. But what I want to do for you is just kind of continue with our coverage here as President Trump's U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with officials in Geneva on Tuesday for those discussions on Iran's nuclear program. Iran's foreign minister emerged from the talk saying the U.S. and Iran found some common ground. But at the same time, Iranian officials have threatened military action of their own, and some have questioned whether Iran can be trusted in those talks. Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei went on an X rant during the talks, presenting some strong words for President Trump and the U.S., which, in all honesty, is not really that different from what we've heard from him in the past. So the question is, what happens next? Ben Cohen is a senior analyst and rapid response director at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, bringing him in now to talk a little bit more about where we head next. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this morning.
Good morning, Josh. Good to be with you.
Thank you. And of course, wanted to ask you here, we heard from Iran's foreign minister right after those talks concluded yesterday, possibly still kind of ongoing at the time, but he seemed to indicate that there was at least a little success that took place. I wanted to get your take on his comments and what you feel kind of progressed maybe during those talks.
Well, in some ways, Josh, I think the most significant thing happened outside the talks, because as those talks were taking place and as envoys Witkoff and Kushner were arriving in Geneva, Iran actually carried out naval drills in the Gulf, and you had live fire exercises going on. Now, that waterway where those naval drills were being carried out carries 20% of the world's oil. And Iran was basically sending a very strong message that, look, any attack on us will result in a major rupture to the world's oil supplies. So, you know, in Geneva, we're hearing a lot of sugar-coated words from the Iranian delegation, but one could also argue that what we're seeing in terms of the Gulf and in terms of that naval exercise yesterday carried out by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, that's where we're seeing the real Iran. I think as well, in terms of Foreign Minister Araghchi's comments yesterday, that good progress is being made. What struck me is that there is very little detail that is being shared. And we know already that two of the three topics that the US wants to negotiate with Iran, though the three topics are the support for terror proxies, Iran's ballistic missile program, and Iran's nuclear program. The Iranians are only willing to talk about the nuclear program. They're not willing to talk about their ballistic missiles. They're not willing to talk about their support for terrorist organizations around the Middle East. And even on the nuclear program, I don't think that the U.S. administration is going to get the kind of deal that it's looking for. The Iranian deputy foreign minister over the weekend was saying, well, if we end our enrichment activity, our uranium enrichment activities, or we move these activities abroad, we want you to lift sanctions. So I personally don't see much of a path forward for these negotiations.
And you kind of mentioned not really getting a lot of information. We haven't really heard from the White House to get a full reaction. What I will say is, I mentioned this earlier, but Vice President Vance appeared on Fox News Channel and talked very briefly about this. I want to play that quick portion for you right here.
It was very clear that the president has set some red lines that the Iranians are not yet willing to actually acknowledge and work through. The president of the United States is very much trying to find a solution here, whether it's through diplomatic options or through another option that means that the Iranians cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Any change, anything you're hearing from that kind of stands out to you? Again, it's a very short soundbite there from Vice President Vance, but what does that tell us, if anything?
Well, I think what we heard there was actually quite an efficient summary of the negotiations. There are some vague good intentions, but the two sides are too far apart. And I think as well, again, if you look at the comments that have been made by members of the administration over the last few days, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of optimism out there. Secretary Rubio was in Munich last weekend for the Munich Security Conference, and he pointed out, look, no one's ever done a successful deal with Iran. And I think with all the best intentions in the world, that rule is going to apply here as well. So I think that, and of course, President Trump has said, again in the last few days, that as far as he's concerned, the best outcome here would be a change of regime in Iran. So I don't think that they are holding out too much hope for these negotiations. And I think, again, I'm always reminded whenever there are talks with Iran of that old cliche that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think we're in a little bit of a situation like that now with Iran. So the question, Josh, I think is going to be, how long does this negotiating process go on for? We're seeing, as illustrated in the pictures that you're showing now, there is a significant U.S. Military buildup in the region. And it could be that at some point the president and his administration are going to run out of patience, and the focus is going to shift to the kinetic aspect of this dispute with Iran.
And that leads me to this. I want to pop this up once again. It's from Barak Ravid over at Axios. His reporting usually spot on there. Now, he posted this article this morning and said, quote, Trump moves closer to a major war with Iran. It could come sooner and be much bigger than most recognized sources tell me. That's his story there on Axios. Anything to take away from that? Of course, I have not read the full story just yet, and I'm not sure if you have either. But anything to take away just from those words that you're seeing on your screen?
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. I mean, we're seeing, again, particularly over the last 24 hours, a very significant military buildup. You've got more than 30 F-16s heading to the region. You've got about a dozen, I believe, F-22s that are heading to the region. We already have the Abraham Lincoln carrier in the region. The Gerald Ford is now on its way. So yes, there is a very big buildup of U.S. military hardware in the region, and I think that sends a message very clear message to the Iranian regime that there is a limited time frame. There's a limited window now for negotiations, but there is a lot of firepower in place there. I think as well, it's important to remember the context of this current round of conflict with Iran. You know, we had in January massive demonstrations across Iran. Of all the protest waves of the last 15 years, that was the biggest. Last weekend, you had demonstrations of, the Iranian diaspora in various cities. I think around 1 million people in total were out demonstrating and heeding the call for regime change. That seems to have encouraged the battered citizens of Iran to revive their protests. I've been seeing a lot of video over the last couple of days of Iranians, in the street, at home, chanting the slogans that we heard in January, that they want an end to the regime, that they want an end to the Ayatollahs. So I do think that, we're on the cusp really of perhaps the most significant change in the region since the October 7th massacre in Israel 2.5 years ago. But there was always the possibility, particularly with this administration, that it pulls back right at the point where you think it's going to unleash the firepower that it's building up there.
It's also important to note that one of President Trump's kind of sticking points here, what led him to initially make the comments that Iran would be struck by the U.S., we're talking weeks ago, was those protests that were getting underway and executions of the protesters, demonstrators. We've heard many different totals for death counts from different groups there, as little as maybe 5,000 or 6,000, and then as high as 30,000, maybe even higher. Does it appear that those executions are still continuing despite comments there from the Iranian regime that they are not executing people?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And in fact, my colleagues who work on the Iran program at FDD have been monitoring this very closely. And we've seen increasingly now that people who were arrested during the January demonstrations are being prepared for execution now. And I believe there have already been some executions of protesters from last month there. So they're absolutely continuing with that. And they're continuing, by the way, Josh, with other sorts of barbaric behavior, punishing entire families, which is a classic tactic of totalitarian and dictatorial regimes, refusing medical treatment to injured protesters. So I think, again, for all the sugar-coated words you hear from Iranian officials and from their foreign minister, nothing has really changed on the ground there. They are very much still in active repression mode.
All right, my last question, as always, for you. What do we watch for here in the coming hours, days, all of it?
Well, I think we need to see the completion of this build-up in the Middle East. I think that, the arrival of the Gerald Ford could potentially be a significant development in terms of how quickly we get to some kind of military action on Iran. The question as well is, will the Iranians blink now? They've never blinked in the past. When they were negotiating with the Obama administration a decade ago, I think that they dominated those negotiations, and their agenda set those negotiations. I think that they got accustomed to leading the US and its allies in this kind of merry dance around the nuclear program. I think there's a lot less patience and tolerance for that with this administration.
All right, Ben Cohen, as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here. Anything we missed that you want to make sure that we add here before I let you go?
Well, just one quick point I want to make. I think you'll remember that last June, Israel and the US carried out serious airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities and other military installations. And when that happened, they basically had the discreet cooperation of the Arab states in the region. And now the Arab states and Turkey are actively lobbying against military action with Iran. So I would say, in terms of watching the situation, trying to figure out where it's evolving, let's look at what the Arab states are saying and doing. And remember that we have a major airbase in Qatar, at Al Udeid in Qatar. And if the Qatari emir does not allow the US to use that base in any action on Iran, then I think, we would have to seriously consider the value of having a military base in a country that is like Qatar, that basically shuts off access at just the time that we need it.
All right. Ben Cohen there at the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you again for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Josh.
And of course, we will continue to bring you all of the updates coming in on the U.S. and Iran relations. If we get any remarks from President Trump on Truth Social or elsewhere, we'll bring those to you right away. And of course, you can imagine that is going to be a topic of discussion at 1 p.m. Eastern time as we hear from Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary. She's going to hold that briefing 1 p.m. Eastern time today. You can watch it in full right here, commercial free, on LiveNOW from Fox as it begins. I'm going to keep saying it, but 1 p.m. Eastern time.